When going to confession, there are 3 acts that the penitent, the person going to confession, must make. They are to express contrition, they are, of course, to make their confession, and then they are to do their penance, what we call satisfaction. Let us look at the first of these, contrition, what it is and how it is rightly expressed. First, let us define contrition. When we talk about having contrition, above all, we are expressing sorrow over our sins. But it is more than just a sentiment of sorrow in our heart. It is the recognition that our sins have done harm and that we are remorseful for having committed them, yes, but also that we want to see to it that we would never commit these sins ever again. What we call a firm purpose of amendment, a decision to not go back where we had once gone in the way of sin. And this contrition is an essential part of making a good confession, if for no other reason. The Lord waits for us to open our hearts to Him. Whenever He comes to us with His grace, it is truly up to our own free will to accept His grace or reject that grace. And within the sacrament of penance, surely we go to be forgiven of our sins. But if we have no intention of changing our way of life, or for that matter, if we go and confess our sins with a mentality that says, well, I have to be forgiven if I'm going to go to heaven, but I don't really feel bad that I did what I did, we're not truly open to receiving that grace. It is only when we open our hearts fully and rightly to the Lord that He can enter in. And that requires humility, that requires reverence for God, that requires that we would not presume anything from God, which in its own right is a sin, to be presumptuous, but instead that we would recognize the harm done by our sins and accordingly be sorry for them, wanting to never commit them again. And surely anyone who loves knows what it is to have such contrition if they have done something that has hurt one whom they love, how they regret what they have done and how they want to make it right and how they want to never again go down that path of hurting their loved one in the way that they did. And so contrition is a very real part of our human life, our human condition, and it is something that in the sacrament of penance, it's not a demanding way of expressing ourselves. It's simply an awareness that we are weak and we do fall and we are sorry when we give in to those temptations, and we want with all of our heart to change our ways, to amend our life, to not go back to those ways of sin. So this is what is at the heart of contrition, or as we can say, being contrite. Now, in the sacrament of penance, we are called, of course, to say a prayer called the act of contrition. And this is simply done so that our expression of contrition can be outward and open, that the priest, hearing our confession as the minister of God in that place, will truly see our desire to turn away from sin in the future and the fact that we regret our sins and do not want to commit them anymore. And surely we want to begin our process of preparing for confession by praying for contrition, by asking that the Lord would give us a right disposition to express our sorrow for our sin and to want to change our ways so that once again we can open ourselves. But we need to express this outwardly so that the priest, for his part in giving the absolution, truly is aware that we want to receive that grace, as opposed to being there with no want to receive that grace, and therefore the grace being ineffective to the point where why should the priest give the grace in the first place or offer it? And this is why at times, though rare, sometimes priests have to withhold absolution from people because they do not have that right contrition. They do not express that purpose to amend their life, to change their ways, and to seek to go down the path of sin no longer. Now, contrition itself comes in two forms, and both of these forms of contrition are acceptable within the sacrament of penance, though one truly is better than the other, as the names will show. On the one hand, we can have imperfect contrition. And for our contrition to be imperfect simply means that we are sorry for our sins, yes, and we don't want to do them anymore, but we're sorry because we're afraid. We fear punishment. We fear the loss of heaven and the pains of hell, as one version of the act of contrition prayer would articulate it. We fear what the consequences of our sins are, and therefore we are contrite because we don't want to face punishment. And surely this is real contrition, and we need to again emphasize that such imperfect contrition is acceptable within our going to receive absolution. But there is another, a more perfect form of contrition, and thus the name, what we call perfect contrition, which is once more sorry for our sins and seeks to amend our life. But rather than being afraid of punishment, we are sorry because we have offended. We have offended God. We have offended our neighbor. We have not been perfect in our love. And in our want for a more perfect love, we are sorry for our sins. And keep in mind that the punishments are exactly the same. So if a person comes in and confesses a mortal sin with imperfect contrition, it's because they are afraid of the loss of heaven and the pains of hell. But if they commit a mortal sin with perfect contrition, were they not to confess that sin, those punishments would be the same, but instead their own heart is disposed to receive the grace of God in such a way that they are sorry for having offended God and his love, and they desire to love him more perfectly. And in truth, we want to continue to grow in our faith journey, that whenever we are called to express contrition, that it would hopefully be this perfect form of contrition. For after all, St. John in his letters speaks of how true love casts out all fear. And so, please God, each and every one of us is receiving your grace to no longer be afraid, but always to seek you in true love. And so perfect contrition is aligned with such a desire for perfect love of God. It's important too, when we talk about contrition, to recognize that there are instances, let's say, where we commit a sin and we are devastated by it, that we can, in that moment, go to the Lord and make a perfect act of contrition, let's say. And when we talk about a perfect act of contrition, again, it's praying that prayer, or one version of the prayer of the act of contrition, in such a way that we are seeking God's mercy and forgiveness, sorrowing over our sin, desiring never to go there again, out of perfect love of God. And there may be instances in life where the opportunity to go to confession is not readily available. Let's say you're in a place where confession is rarely offered, which is unfortunate, but for reasons beyond our control, it does happen. Mission territory, let's say, or being on the road and not necessarily knowing where to go. The fact of the matter is, if we make a perfect act of contrition, we can be at rest that we have at least given that much to the Lord, but we should still seek to make a good confession as soon as we are able. And in this way, that perfect act of contrition is already disposing us to the help of the Lord to both be forgiven, but also not to go down that path of sin any longer. But it's always imperative, as we will look at in the next video with regards to confessing of our sins, that if we have committed a serious mortal sin, that we want to make right recourse to seeking the sacrament of penance as soon as possible. And if that's not going to be readily possible, that we would seek to make a perfect act of contrition, praying for that grace to express our contrition directly to God, but with that desire to love Him more perfectly. And so you see, contrition is a very important part of the sacrament of penance. Once more, to sum up, to receive the sacrament of penance calls us to open ourselves, and contrition, by expressing sorrow for our sin and the desire to turn away from the near occasion of sin, is truly a way that opens us. Whereas to have no contrition and to presume on God's forgiveness is not only irreverent, but honestly a further sin, an insult to God, as though we can control Him or tell Him what to do. So we always want to pray for the grace to have a contrite heart, to show our true contrition when we commit sins, and thus open ourselves to the graces of absolution, as is essential in the sacrament of penance. May God bless you.